While he's setting that up, I'll just start talking. Apologetics and offering evidence for Christianity, or evidence for the existence of God, or evidence for the reliability of the Bible, the authority of the Bible. Oftentimes apologetics organizations, Ratio Christi included, Reasons to Believe, we get into a lot of here's the evidence for the existence of God, and sometimes we forget that Christianity is about Jesus. I know that may seem obvious, but a lot of apologetics, even Ratio Christi, the name means reason for Christ. So we're not trying to just convert atheists to theists, although that may be the first step. We're ultimately trying to help people see that Jesus is Lord, and that and His purposes here on the earth are what are really important. Reasons to Believe is similar. Hugh Ross, though he excels at giving evidence for the fine-tuning of the universe and showing how that shows the existence of a creator, though he excels at that, he is also an evangelist at heart. So it's reasons to believe in Jesus, not just reasons to believe in anything. Okay. So Ken Samples is one of RTB's scholars. He's one of the scholars on the team, and the title of this is really taken from a chapter of his book. I had the opportunity out in California to talk to him about the fact that Reasons to Believe, because he's part of it, and because there's his book. I think one will be given away at the end of tonight's presentation, for that matter. Because he's part of the team, and he's written on philosophy, theology, archaeology, history, that sort of thing, it really opens up this meeting to any of those types of topics, so that we don't just have to talk about evolution, creation, old earth versus young earth, that kind of thing. Even though we do spend a lot of time talking about those important issues, chapter 8 of his book is entitled, Is Jesus a Man, Myth, Madman, Menace, Mystic, Martian, or the Messiah? He was playing off of, if you're familiar with C.S. Lewis's argument, is Jesus Lord, liar, or lunatic? One of the criticisms of C.S. Lewis's argument is that it doesn't cover all of the options. And so Ken Samples decided that he would cover all of the options and decided to use an M motif instead of the L. So I asked him how long it took to come up with that. He said it took some time to come up with all of them. Anyhow,
you tried all the other letters first.
Yeah,
It's a long time.
Reading a verse here, and here's let me read the verse first. God, this is the first three verses of Hebrews. God, after He spoke long ago to the fathers in the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, through whom also He made the world. And He is the radiance of His glory, that is, Jesus is the radiance of God's glory, and the exact representation of His nature, and upholds all things by the word of His power. This is the testimony of the book of Hebrews, and I find it interesting that every time it seems like I'm going to be giving a presentation like this, God puts a circumstance in my life where I'm talking to somebody that's appropriate. So I was talking to a gentleman that I work with last week, and he was talking about how he could believe in a creator God, but he didn't really believe in a God that answered prayer, or God that speaks to us. And it was this verse that came to my mind. We don't just believe in a God who's out there, who is like a deistic creator who lit the match and started everything, and then here we are. We believe in a God who's actually a part of the creation, who is immanent in the creation, even though He's transcendent over it, and that He speaks to us, and He's given us reasons for why He's here, or why we're here, and why He did this. And He even sent His Son to give us that message in these last days. In order to show that Jesus is who He said He was, it leads us naturally to the resurrection, which Paul says in 1 Corinthians, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is vain. Your faith also is vain. Moreover, we are even found to be false witnesses of God, because we testified against God that He raised Christ, And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You're still in your sins. If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. If there's not an afterlife after this, then why are we doing this? Okay? Why are we spending our time worshiping the Lord Jesus Christ and what he did on this earth if there is no resurrection of the dead? So the resurrection is very important, and it helps us. The evidence for the resurrection will help us identify who Jesus is. The resurrection and the identity of Jesus are the fundamentals of the Christian faith, or some of them anyhow. So, preeminent importance. And with that, I want to ask the question, who is Jesus? Jesus asked the same question to his disciples. Who do you say that I am? So let's take a look at the evidence. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my son, Duran.
All right.
Whom I'm very proud of, by the way.
I'm really happy to be here. I gave this presentation this past semester at Georgia State, and my dad's helped me kind of refine it a bit, and we've added some things.
A lot of material to cover.
Yeah, it's very, yes, it's a very, there's a lot of evidence, there's a lot to cover. So, but we're just gonna dive right into history. Let's talk about some extra biblical evidence of the resurrection. There was a Jewish historian whose name was Josephus, who wrote, I know it's kind of small, but he wrote, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man." This is in white. The things in, I just want to quickly mention too, that the things that are in white in this passage here are sections of this passage that are contested by historians as to whether or not they're actually original to the passage. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. "For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him." I'm going to skip this. "And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." And he was writing this probably, that's his lifespan, probably around the
80, I think.
80? Yeah. So the point is that this was a historian who was writing about what was going on at the time that he was writing, and he said that there were Christians out there who were talking about this guy Jesus, who was their leader, and this guy, Josephus, wrote down that Pilate had him crucified, and that he was a wise teacher and all of that. Most people are, Josephus is pretty popular to quote when it comes to citing extra biblical evidence for Jesus, but like I said, these passages in white are contested by historians because it seems that there were probably some overzealous scribes who probably inserted these things in there. They don't seem to be characteristic of Josephus. He seems to be awfully reverent towards Jesus, but in reality, like, he was a Jew. And this section here, "For he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold, and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him." He just seems to be speaking really favorably about Jesus, and we do have some manuscripts of his writings where those parts of the passage are not included. So a lot of skeptics don't like to talk about Josephus because they say, "Oh, well, it's been tampered with, we don't know what's original." But I'm going to show you something that a lot of times they don't show you, with both the skeptics and the Christians when they talk about Josephus. Josephus didn't just talk about Jesus and the Christians at the time. He actually talked about several other figures that are written about in the Bible. Josephus wrote specifically about Herod and John the Baptist, about how Herod had John the Baptist killed, which is in, I think, at least two of the Gospels in the New Testament. He wrote about Jesus' brother James, who was... Yeah, so he wrote about James, he wrote, "Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others." So we have him here referring to James in a very in a very just basic way. There doesn't seem to be any bias here about that. He seems to matter-of-factly state that James was the brother of Jesus Christ. Josephus also mentions in some of his writings Caiaphas the high priest, Herod's brother Philip, which was part of this ordeal with Herod and John the Baptist, Ananias the high priest, and King Agrippa. All of these are characters who are in the Bible. So we already have a historian who's mentioning characters and events that are recorded in the Bible as well. Also, we have this guy Thallus, approximately 52. Now this is strange. Now this is a true example of how history works, because this passage we're talking about comes from this chronicle, who is written by Sinclaus, but he's quoting Africanus, and Africanus is quoting Thallus. And the whole point of this is that Thallus is speaking of the strange darkness that happened on the day of the resurrection. And Thallus is actually, he tries to attribute it to an eclipse. That's rather what he's arguing, but Africanus is critiquing that claim. But again, this is just this is a very basic, unbiased perspective on what happened on the day of the crucifixion. It's just like, well, the crucifixion happened. It seems to be a given in this passage. Nobody seems to be contesting it. Even though I believe none of these guys, as far as we know, were Christians or were believers in any sense. Then we have this guy Tacitus, who wrote, "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, which was probably the resurrection, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular." He was a very cheery fellow. But Tacitus was writing about what Nero was doing to the Christians this was around, I guess, probably right before 70 AD. Yeah, so no later than 68 AD is what he's talking about here. Now, this might seem kind of like a duh statement, but let's consider for a moment that what's being said here is we have Tacitus writing that there were actually Christians prior to 68 AD, and Nero, we have good record that Nero was killing them. He was actually, in fact, I took Latin this last semester, and part of that was learning some of the history of Rome. And one thing that our professor mentioned was that the Romans, in all of their glory, they used to light their parties. You know, they would throw feasts and parties in their, with the rich people, and they would light them by setting prisoners on fire. But what the professor didn't mention was that those prisoners were Christians. They were Christians that Nero had condemned to die, and so they would set them on fire to light the parties.
Do you know if this is the source for some of those accounts in Fox's Book of Martyrs as well? Is this the earliest mention?
I'm not sure about the earliest mention, but definitely among them. Because, I mean, Tacitus was writing between 55 and 120 AD. So, I mean, he would have been right there in the right time period. Also, we have Pliny the Younger. He was a Roman governor, and he was writing to Emperor Trajan. He wrote, "The Christians were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up, after which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind." Now, the reason this is important is because it gives us a clue as to what the Christians were doing. what they believed. A particularly important section of this is that they sang verses and hymns to Christ as to a god. Now, he's writing this around 112 AD, so we can infer from this that around 112 AD there were Christians worshiping Christ as God. So skeptics who like to say, well, that this God worship idea of Jesus didn't come around until like way later. Well, no, it's actually it's right there. Now Pliny was writing to Trajan. Trajan actually wrote back. He said, "The method you have pursued, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those denounced to you as Christians is extremely proper. It is not possible to lay down any general rule which can be applied as the fixed standard in all cases of this nature. No search should be made for these people. When they are denounced and found guilty, they must be punished. With the restriction, however, that when the party denies himself to be a Christian and shall give proof that he is not, that is, by adoring our gods, Roman gods, he shall be pardoned on the ground of repentance, even though he may have formerly incurred suspicion." Now, the important thing about this is Trajan is telling Pliny, fine, hunt the Christians down, but give them a chance to denounce their God. Give them a chance to denounce it. Make them worship our gods. If they do that, we'll spare them. What's interesting is we don't have any records of Christians actually ever denouncing their God on these grounds. We don't have any records of anybody taking up this offer. Now, here's a fun guy. Lucian, he was a 2nd century satirist. So he was writing in kind of a mocking tone. The Christians, worship a man to this day. Note, worship a man to this day. The distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. So there's 2 facts. Christians worship Jesus as God. And that he was crucified. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers, from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage, another important part, and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property. Now, he's actually mocking the Christians in what he's writing here, but actually it's really handy for us because it's just another record of what was going on at the time. So everybody say thank you to Lucian. All right, there were also some other dudes who wrote about stuff like these things. There was the Jewish Talmud between 70 and 200 AD. It refers to Yeshua being crucified. Bar Serapion of Syria wrote about the Jews' wise king who was executed, but they lived on his teachings. Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, he was chief secretary of Emperor Hadrian. He wrote about Chrestus instigating the Jews against Rome, which it's interesting that he would say that. He also referenced Nero's punishment of the Christians, and then we also have Emperor Hadrian himself writing about how to properly try and convict Christians. Now, this is all extra biblical evidence. These come from ancient history sources, ancient writings in history. Now, consider that everything I've said up until this point doesn't come from the Bible. Let's take into account all of the facts that we've learned from all of these writings. Not from the Bible, but just from these historical writings. We've learned that a wise man / teacher named Jesus / Christus, who performed amazing feats, was crucified by Pontius Pilate, who we know was prefect from between 26 and 36 AD, during the reign of Tiberius, who ruled between 14 and 37 AD. So those are two dates that corroborate the time of the crucifixion. The crucifixion was accompanied by an unusual darkness. That was Thallus. A mischievous superstition from Judea was the belief of the Christians, which was the resurrection. Many Jews and Gentiles were converted to Christianity. Christians met on a fixed day to pray, worship, and eat, which is Sunday gatherings. Christians worshipped the man Jesus as God. Christians were asked to denounce their God. Christians were generally morally upstanding citizens. Christians were willing to die for their beliefs. Christians were being persecuted as early as 64 AD by Nero. I haven't even read any Bible verses to you. This all came from extra biblical sources. This is all stuff that's in history, even if we didn't have a Bible. So,
And we have John the Baptist and
yeah, and we have corroboration about John the Baptist and all these other characters.
Yep.
So, this leads us to asking questions. What caused all the commotion? What caused devoted monotheistic Jews to begin worshiping a historical man? Because the way that they saw it, that was kind of blasphemous. What caused them to stop following the law of Moses? Were they just lazy, or did they actually have a reason? What caused them to change their day of worship to Sunday? Because that was kind of the day after the Sabbath. What caused them to be willing to die horrible deaths for what they believed? Well, if only they wrote a book or something, you know? If only they wrote some of their reasons down. Like, why didn't they write some of this down? But I think Dad has a book by them.
I think, yeah.
I think he's got some sources to quote from these guys who supposedly worship Jesus.
So those are the extra biblical sources. When we turn to the biblical sources, obviously we have some more specific information. They did write it down. These are some pictures of some of the early manuscripts that we have. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels, give us more specific information about what these people believed, on why all of those things happened. If you were a Jew, even a Jew today, imagine what it is like to suddenly start to worship Jesus as God, to deny worship on the Sabbath, to not be sacrificing and going to the temple like you used to. We're talking about a major event here. So what did they say? Now we know, of course, that they talked about the resurrection. So I want to ask these three questions and run through the evidence for them real quick. Can we trust the New Testament writers? Because we know what they wrote. Has the New Testament been corrupted? In other words, do we have what they originally wrote? Was the New Testament written close to the events? And was it written by eyewitnesses? So let's answer those questions real quick. Has the New Testament been corrupted? So far to date, the current number that last I saw was 5,838 Greek New Testament manuscripts that they have to help textual critics to determine what was originally written. Are there differences in those manuscripts? Yes, there are. But the differences in the manuscripts still allow them to be able to determine what was originally written. And on top of that, we also have thousands of copies in Syriac, Latin, Coptic, and Aramaic. After you go through and sort through all of the manuscripts, it can be said with confidence that out of the New Testament, we have 99.5 to 99.7% of it is uncorrupted. That means that it's what was originally written. I actually want to say that figure is more like 103 to 104%. Here's what I mean by that. We have everything that they wrote, plus some stuff. You see what I'm saying? There are some Bible verses like the ending of the book of Mark and the story of the Samaritan woman or the adulterous woman in John 8 that are questionable, that don't appear in some of the earliest manuscripts. But those at worst are merely additions to what was already there. So I would say we have 100% of what they originally wrote. We have that, plus some extra stuff. But it also means that 99.5% of the New Testament is authentic. So we don't have to worry about it having been changed, as the Muslims like to tell us that it's been changed, or the Mormons like to tell us that the manuscripts have been changed. They can't point to any place to show where their ideas were once in the scriptures and then have been removed. They can't show any of that. What we have is what was originally written. So, and we have very ample evidence to show that to be the case. If we have what was originally written, was it written close to the events? Well, when were the events? Well, the crucifixion is either one of those 2 days, April 7th of 30 AD, or my preferred version, which is April 3rd of 33 AD. It's easy to remember 4333. So, the resurrection would have happened 3 days later, or a couple of days later. Paul's conversion, scholars will tell you, was roughly in the 2-year range after the resurrection, so somewhere 32 to 35 AD. Paul meets Peter for the first time 3 years after his conversion, so again that's around 35 to 38. That's probably when he received one of the early creeds, which we'll see that he wrote in Corinthians, but he wrote Galatians and Corinthians in 55 to 56 AD. He was imprisoned in Rome in 60 to 63 AD, which is where the book of Acts ends. It leaves us with Paul imprisoned in Rome. Peter, James, and Paul, we know by church history, by tradition, were martyred under Nero, 64 to 67 AD. And of course, the destruction of Jerusalem was in 70 AD, which was the culmination of the Jewish wars that began a few years earlier than that. So these are when the events happened. When we look at the Gospels themselves, I find this slide to be kind of interesting because it supports what's known as the Markan priority. In other words, that Mark was written first. The reason that a lot of scholars think that is basically because 93 to 97, depending on which source I was looking at, of Mark is contained in Matthew and Luke. So if you've ever read all of the Gospels, you'll know that they repeat each other in a lot of cases, but at least 93% of what's in Mark is in Matthew and Luke. So it would seem likely that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source for what they wrote. Matthew and Luke also appear to abridge some of Mark's stories. They're a little bit shorter in some cases. So why would Mark leave out much of Jesus' teachings if he was copying Matthew? So those long sections like the Sermon on the Mount aren't in Mark. If you were thinking it was the other way around, you would think Mark would have probably included some of those lengthier sections, but he didn't. Mark also tends to have a rougher, less polished Greek style. Matthew and Mark tend to alter potentially theological difficulties, like the story of Jesus healing the withered hand. Mark specifically says that Jesus was angry at the people around him, but Matthew and Luke leave that detail out. Mark contains more Aramaic words, which Matthew and Luke translate to Greek. What it tells us, though, it tells us the purple sections is what's shared by all three of the Gospels. The blue section in the middle, down at the bottom, is what's shared between Matthew and Luke. We know that Luke tells us in the beginning he interviewed sources. It's very possible, this is by the blue section, if you ever heard of the source of Q, that's the blue. That's where they believe that Matthew and Luke got that information. In my mind, it's very possible Luke just got it from Matthew as one of his sources, and that's the reason why some of that material is also in there. The green section is what is unique to Luke. In my opinion, that is because he interviewed Jesus' mother, Mary, and tells a lot of the early stories that are from her perspective. In fact, his genealogy is from her perspective in the front part of his book. So it's very likely that's where he was getting his information.
Which is to say it's a matriarchal genealogy, as opposed to the patriarchal genealogy in Matthew.
Yeah. Matthew, his green section over there, in my mind, probably came from him. It's what he recalled specifically. That just in addition to it, since he was one of the 12. Yeah.
Wasn't Matthew the tax collector? So wouldn't he have been literate? And,
Yes.
I mean, I keep thinking about the Sermon on the Mount. There's so much detail in Matthew. So you have to, here I am taking notes. I'm wondering if he did that.
I don't know whether he took notes or not. It's hard to say.
But I mean,
But
that's so detailed.
Yeah, I mean, it specifically says the Holy Spirit, of course, would remind them of what Jesus said. And we also know that what they wrote down as Jesus' words were more like his ideas, not always his exact words in that sense. So, yeah.
What do you think of the idea that the Sermon on the Mount is maybe not just one specific sermon? They've heard Jesus talk many, many times. And basically, it was.
It very well
of all
could have been. Yeah, it's certainly not the 20 minutes or so, or that it takes you to just read it real quick. Yeah, it's not. It was certainly much longer, you would think. At any rate, it appears that Mark came first. Without going into a whole lot of detail, let me give you an idea of how the scholars, conservative scholars, date Mark. Clement of Alexandria, who was one of the early church fathers, claimed Mark wrote his gospel while Peter was ministering in Rome. Incidentally, Mark is usually considered to be eyewitness accounts of Peter. So Mark is recording basically a long interview with Peter about what he was teaching. Eusebius says Peter came to Rome when Claudius was emperor, which we know was from 41 to 54 AD. Peter appears to be in Jerusalem in Acts 15, circa 49 AD. And Peter appears to have been in Corinth before Paul, because Paul refers to the summer of Peter and the summer of Barnabas and so on, which was written around 55 AD. Paul appears to quote Luke in 1 Corinthians, so Luke would have already been written by that time, and if Luke was using Mark as one of his sources, then that puts Mark before 55 AD, but after 50 AD. See how that works? So we have roughly, Mark was written roughly 20 years after the events of Jesus' crucifixion. Some stuff dates earlier than that, by the way. We'll get to that in a minute. Anybody who's been following this, I showed you some manuscript copies on that one first slide of the New Testament. It shows the oldest current extant manuscript that has been examined by all scholars, which is a portion of the Gospel of John. However, an article in Live Science called Mummy Mask May Reveal Oldest Known Gospel, it's written in 2015. Apparently one of the research members of the people that were looking into some old manuscripts found in mummy masks leaked information in 2012 about a fragment of the Gospel of Mark recovered from an Egyptian mummy mask. Craig Evans says that the text was dated through a combination of carbon-14 dating, studying the handwriting on the fragment, and studying the other documents found along with the Gospel, which incidentally left. Some of those other documents were dated. In other words, they hand dated them, whatever dating method they were using at the time. These considerations led the researchers to conclude that this fragment was written before the year 90. So it may very well be possible. Last time Bart Ehrman's blog said that it is currently set to be released in 2017. So it hasn't been released to the general public, but it does appear that there's a fragment of Mark out there that is at least dating earlier than the year 90. So from the first century.
Are the
Yes.
mummy masks like paper mache?
Yeah.
So this is like they were just trashing them.
Yes. Yeah, that's, paper it's not like you could buy it at Walmart like we can these days. And so they were using whatever scraps that they could find. And it was old scraps of whatever copies. So it's not only New Testament manuscripts that they're finding copies of a lot of documents in these things. So it's really enriching the manuscript evidence, and some people are complaining that it's destroying Egyptian mummy masks. However, part of this article, Craig Evans makes it quite plain, he also works with Dan Wallace, who's a New Testament scholar who's been cataloging all of these manuscript copies. They made it quite plain that they are not destroying museum-worthy pieces. They're destroying little bitty bits and pieces of things that nobody would really want to look at anyway.
They're not mummies of important people anyway.
And that's true too. They're of your average Joe. So, was the New Testament written close to the events? When you look at conservative dates, they all are before 70 AD. Matthew, Mark, Luke are all in those early 50s. The liberal dates put them in the 66 to 90 range. One of the reasons why the liberals date it that far back is because Jesus prophesied in the Mount Olivet Discourse that the temple would be destroyed and every stone would be torn down, which is exactly what happened when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. And since they have a bias against miracles, they would say these accounts could possibly have been written before the events. And so therefore, most of the liberal scholars will date them after 70 AD. However, there's very strong internal evidence and even external evidence that these things were written before that. So this gives you an idea. I do find it at least interesting that the liberal and conservative dates match exactly when it comes to Paul's letters. So they don't disagree that Paul wrote those letters and that he wrote them in as early as 48 AD, possibly for Galatians or Thessalonians.
Well, where's Hebrews?
I didn't put every book up there.
Hebrews is the important.
Well, I agree. It's an important book, but if
They're all
I put
important.
every book up there, then we'd all be squinting, probably already doing it. So.
We didn't really go into this in our presentation, though, but it's really important to note that in terms of dating documents in history, coming within 20 years of the events in question is incredible. Because there are events that we regard as just plain old history that are taught every day in school, and we don't have accounts of these things until hundreds of years later. And nobody questions them because, number one, they're corroborated by like archaeology and other writings. But by that same standard, like when you apply that standard to the Bible, this is what we get. I mean, these are the liberal dates, these are the skeptics, these are the non-believers. They're giving us these dates. And frankly, even if you take for me personally, even if you take the liberal dates from the Gospels, that's still amazing.
Still within their lifetime.
Yeah.
Many of them, or within the lifetime of many of the people in this room, for sure, including my own. This particular slide is taken from J. Warner Wallace's book. He talks about, if you go backwards from here, we know the temple was destroyed in AD 70, the siege of Jerusalem 67 to 70, the death of James, Peter, and Paul 61 to 65. Luke had to write Acts before that, because Paul quotes Luke, and Acts is written before Luke.
Well, and also because Luke doesn't report the destruction of the temple, and he also doesn't report the death of James, Peter, or Paul.
Which are pretty important.
Acts was written before Luke.
Did I say that? I didn't mean to say that. Okay. No, Luke, Acts was written after.
Show you were paying attention.
Okay, thank you. If I said that, wait, reverse that. Yeah.
Luke wrote Luke, Luke wrote Acts.
There you go. Yeah.
Since we're on this question, I mean, it always occurred to me, because a lot is made of the fact that Luke did not reference Paul's death and did not reference the destruction of Jerusalem. But suppose he wrote a trilogy that we don't have, the third volume.
That is possible,
They knew better than
but
the
it
people back then.
still shows
I'd love to
that.
find it too, of course.
But it still shows that Acts, of course, was probably written early enough before those events. You see what I'm saying?
No, I mean, he stayed.
Okay, in other words,
scrolls had a length. There was a certain length you could make them, and then it wasn't practical to make them any longer than that. So he wrote Luke, and then he wrote Acts, and he cut the history off, and then he wrote the next one.
Do you believe in the 15 Commandments also?
It seems very implausible to me that no copy or no reference to any such work would be around. If there were,
Well, I'd agree with that.
if there are some writings, like there's a writing that's considered to not be canonical that's attributed to Paul, even Paul's letter to the Laodiceans, and they know about it, even though they don't consider it to be authentic. So you would think that even if there were extra writings, or somebody would have known about them and mentioned them somewhere. And there's never been a question among any of the early church fathers about whether Luke or Acts should have been included in the New Testament. Point being here is we have a chain of events that show that these things were written very early, and I'll leave it at that. Even though I don't necessarily agree with Wallace's dating there of the book of Mark, we still have it in the early 50s, which is at most about 20 years after the fact.
It's only a 5-year differential.
Yeah. What were they preaching? Well, here's the early creed in 1 Corinthians. Basically, Paul says, I delivered to you, first of all, that which I received. So he's saying, this is what I got from somebody else, and I brought it to you early. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, Peter, then by the 12. This is like an early creed that Paul is reporting to them, and he's reporting it around 55 to 56 AD, and saying that he had received it before that. And scholars will agree that the book of Galatians talks about him meeting up with Peter and Paul, or Peter and James, and John. It's likely that's when he would have received it, which would have been maybe 3 years after the resurrection, or 3 years after the crucifixion at least. So what we have here is an early creed that was being passed around by the Christians within just a few years of the events. And Paul is giving it to them, and there is no question amongst even liberal scholars as to when Paul wrote this. So what we have here is, what were they preaching? They were preaching the resurrection. The resurrection is what caused them to change their views. And we have the testimony of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, whoever wrote Hebrews, James. Okay, we have at least 7 or 8. If you believe that Paul wrote Hebrews, it'd only be 7. But 7 or 8 testimonies here that are giving us the reasons why they changed their mind. So, was the New Testament written close to the events? It was all written, everybody agrees it was all written in the 1st century. The writing dates range from 0 to 65 years after the event. By that I mean, in some cases, they may have been actually being written during the events. Paul's letters obviously were written right there in the midst of it all. It even appears that parts of Acts were written almost like a journal. At one point, if you're reading through Acts, there's a transition from third person to first person, we. It appears that's when potentially Luke joined Paul on his journeys, and so you have we did this. It's as if he was writing it as they went along. Accounts were written while the eyewitnesses were still alive, so if anybody wanted to dispute what was written, they could have. These dates simply do not allow enough time for legend to develop. Legend experts will tell you it takes at least 2 generations before that kind of thing can happen. It's simply not fast enough. And fabricated legends would have probably used more prominent names in, like, for example, Matthew and Mark. Who were they? I mean, very little is given to us about Matthew or Levi. We're told he's a tax collector, and we're told he threw a party for Jesus, but that's about all we're really told. And Mark was who Barnabas and Paul disputed over about whether he should go on their missionary journeys with them or not. And
Which is kind of embarrassing.
Yeah, so who is he, right? And Luke wasn't even a Jew. So, if you're going to make it up about who wrote these Gospels, seems like you would have used the names of more prominent people, like Peter, or something like that, or Mary. Incidentally, we do have those Gospels that are the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary, but they don't appear until the 2nd century. So what that shows us is Christianity does have its legends. It does. They show up right when we think they should, 100 years later. Okay? And they say things like, the childhood Gospels telling us extra stories about Jesus as a kid, or giving us extra information in extra Gospels, or the Gospel of Thomas, which was really not even Christian sounding. So we have those types of things that show up later. The Christian legends are there, but they're not in the 1st century. The 1st century is not the Christian legends. Those are the ones that are written by the eyewitnesses. So, was it written close to the events?
And they're appropriately not part of the canon.
And they're appropriately not part of the canon, is correct. So even those people back then understood it. So what we have here is miracles need extraordinary evidence. So to support them, but the New Testament records extraordinary eyewitness testimony to miracles. However, scholars will tell you the New Testament can't be trusted because it records miracles. If we have a bias against miracles immediately, that they just don't happen, then this is the kind of thing that you end up in. All right. On the other hand, if you invite God into the picture, if it's even a possibility that he exists, then miracles become a possibility. You can't really deny that. So, was it written by eyewitnesses? Just real quickly, it certainly claims to have been written by eyewitnesses. Peter says, "For we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." Whoever wrote this is claiming to be an eyewitness to the fact and saying that he didn't make it up. So they knew the difference between myth and history.
That's a lot of Bible verses.
That is a lot of Bible verses. To claim eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
If you want to go and check them all out, I put them in here just in case anybody really wanted to know where they were. There they are. Yeah, they knew the difference. Geisler and Turek, in their book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, list 84 facts in Acts and 59 in John that are confirmed by archaeology and history. They had a lot of their facts right. Okay, the New Testament writers got the customs right for the time, the dates right, the order of events, the city leaders, the languages, the weather patterns, the travel patterns, the roads, the topography, and sailing details. They got all of those things right.
The topography?
Meaning they were there. Right? They knew what it was like. They knew what it was like to go up to Jerusalem. Okay? They knew that didn't necessarily mean north. That meant you literally went up. You climbed altitude to get there. So, they got all that right. Can they be trusted on the other stuff? That's the question. Can the New Testament writers be trusted? I believe yes. Has the New Testament been corrupted? No. We have what they originally wrote. Was the New Testament written close to the events? Yes. Was it written by eyewitnesses? It appears to be so, at least claims to be. And they were all preaching the resurrection is the reason why they were believing what they believed. And with that, we'll have to start asking the questions, well, is there an alternative to them being correct? Maybe not. Take it over.
So, okay, they wrote a book, and the book is accurate as far as, in terms of, it's accurate in terms of we can trust what's written in it. But does that mean that they were telling the truth? That's a whole different story.
On that point, just a second.
Yeah.
When we were in Israel, our Jewish guide was extremely literate in the New Testament. He believes completely in the historicity of Jesus. He believes that the things written in the New Testament are correct, to a very high degree, but he's still not a believer that Jesus is the Son of God.
He believes the resurrection?
He believes that, yes, well, I'm not so sure that he believes the resurrection, but he believes that the people that wrote it believed it.
Well, we're going to go into some of those possibilities as to, well, we know for sure that that's what they claimed, but now let's examine their motivations and what was going on in their heads. So were they crazy, or was it all just turned into legend later? So let's go over some of these options. Were they liars? Now the way that this claim goes is that the disciples stole the body of Jesus and they made up the story of the resurrection for the sake of gaining power over a group of people or for the sake of saving face after he was crucified. Because that was pretty humiliating for all of them. And I found a nice picture here of Peter telling a great campfire story and making it look really epic. And it probably was. I especially like this lady. She's like, whoa. But there are problems with this theory that they were liars. First of all, it doesn't really explain the fact that their lives were transformed. Because the picture that's painted in the Gospels especially is that the disciples were kind of stupid. They always asked these dumb questions. They would cower when there was danger. They ran away when Jesus was crucified. And so the fact that that happened and then for some reason they just stepped back out into the public square and risked their lives, which is my second point here. They risked their lives because we know from our extra biblical writings that they were being persecuted by the Romans, and willingly so. And we don't have any records of them denouncing their God, their Christ, in the name of the Roman gods.
Also, change that, by the way. We do have a few records of the fact that some did denounce. The reason why,
Where were they?
well, they're Christian records actually, because the Christians actually once Christianity became legal, the churches had to decide what to do with some of the people who had denounced, and whether they had let them back into the churches. And, well, in other words, now that it was safe to come out, so they actually did have to deal with it. There were some that.
Oh, my
that backed
apologies
off.
for that.
However, from the disciples, from the 12, there was no record at all that any of them ever denounced.
There's also a bigger problem, I think, with this idea that maybe they were liars. And the problem is the idea of sustaining a conspiracy. Because you figure, how many people had to be in on this lie to convince other people that it was true? We're talking about at least the 11 apostles, because Judas Iscariot was dead. At least the 11 apostles all had to agree on the details. And something really cool, I highly recommend this book, Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace, because he is a cold case homicide detective. And he approaches the subject of investigating the resurrection from a really unique standpoint, because he has years and years of experience investigating crimes, and he has worked on crimes where there were multiple guilty parties, and they were all lying, and they were all trying to keep their stories together. And something that he notes is that the more people there were in on the lie, in on the conspiracy, the harder it was for them to keep it together. And obviously, as time went on, it would fall apart, and eventually the story would come to light.
I mentioned Chuck Colson talked about 14 or however many, I think it was 6 or 8 men couldn't keep the conspiracy of Watergate under Nixon a secret for more than 2 weeks. Yeah. So it was like.
But that wouldn't be unusual if under a cult, groupthink, mind control. I mean,
Right.
you look at they commit mass suicides, the rest of that. So if they were under chaotic socioeconomic times where society was breaking down, being persecuted by the Romans,
Right.
they would have to gravitate towards some kind of a small group leadership. So it wouldn't be unusual to have cultic attitudes and mind thinking for that.
That's true. That's true. Except that they were talking about a person, namely Jesus, who had been alive at the same time as them, and everybody knew who Jesus was in their part of town, at least, or really, I mean, all over the country. People knew who Jesus was, so even if the apostles wanted to invent a lie, just the 11 of them, they would have to convince those people who had seen Jesus that was the case. Now, we know from Paul that supposedly there were about 500 other eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus, so we at least have that record.
Were there any writings of the Jews about this? If I were a Pharisee, a Jew, and commissioned the Romans to take out this Essene radical, and they crucified him, good, got rid of that guy, and now he's walking around, I would want my money back.
Yeah.
Sure. The Jewish Talmud does mention Jesus. I forget how many years it is later, but it's not long after.
In the resurrection?
Yeah, he mentioned.
70 is about the earliest.
I mean, while he was alive, but after resurrection.
Well, none of those people believed in the resurrection, so they wouldn't have said. They would have reported something like what the Romans that they believed that this man rose from the dead. That's about the best you can get. We've got their own accounts to say. We know that the Christians believe that it's not disputed that they believe that Jesus rose from the dead, or that's what they were saying. So the question is, were they lying in this case? Yeah.
They don't seem to be lying. The question is, okay, were they delusional? And this claim goes that the disciples were so overcome with grief that they, or maybe because of hard economic times, that they kind of just thought that that was what happened, or maybe they all hallucinated. But there are some problems with this theory. First of all, it doesn't explain the empty tomb, because if they were lying, if it was a conspiracy, then naturally they would have stolen the body and got rid of the body. But if they were delusional, they could have prevented or solved or cured their delusion or their hallucinations by at least going to look at the body and say, oh, well, I mean, there it is, still there. We're going to talk about the empty tomb a little bit later. Also, something that J. Warner Wallace points out in Cold Case Christianity is that grief doesn't cause people to imagine new experiences with the deceased. It only causes them to remember them with fondness. So in other words, if you ask someone what they thought about a deceased person, say who died a year ago or 2 years ago, that person's not going to say, oh yeah, we had lunch yesterday. No, all they're going to say is, oh, they were a really nice person, I really enjoyed meeting them. And they may remember them with more fondness than they actually felt toward them when they were alive. But they're not going to just make up new experiences out of grief. That's not something that they would do. Another thing in terms of hallucinations is that hallucinations just don't happen in groups. There's just not people, and when hallucinations do happen in groups, people don't have the same hallucination, much less more than once. And the disciples claim to have seen the resurrected Jesus multiple times when some of them were away, like Thomas wasn't there the first time that Jesus appeared to them. So the accounts just don't match what we know about hallucinations. Also, in the case of Thomas, he exemplifies the kinds of doubts that the disciples had about the resurrected Jesus, in that they weren't sure if he was a spirit or a body, and they wanted to make sure that he was a body, which is why Thomas said, well, I'm not going to believe this crazy story until I touch him for myself and I put my fingers in his scars. So the fact that the disciples had those kinds of doubts and they were writing about that and they reported that they actually touched his body makes it sound like they knew what they were talking about. They weren't just delusional, they weren't talking about a vision, and they certainly weren't talking about a hallucination. So what's some other options? Maybe they were fooled. Maybe an imposter convinced the disciples that he was Jesus. And I put this picture here. Oh, you can't really see it very well. Anyway, this is a still from the movie Risen, which I highly recommend. It just came out on Blu-ray. I saw it twice in the theater. It's a really great movie about, it's a fictional story of a Roman guard who is sent to investigate the claim of the resurrection of Jesus. And it's really good. It's not cheesy, because I hate cheesy movies. But Risen is a really great movie, and this is from the moment where the Roman guard sees the resurrected Jesus for the first time, which isn't a spoiler. But he sees him for the first time, and he remembers that, oh, that's the guy who was on the cross, that I saw die on the cross. And the point of saying this is that the problems with this theory that they were fooled is that, number one, the disciples were too skeptical, like Thomas, but the others were skeptical as well. They were intimate with Jesus. They knew who Jesus was. They knew his mannerisms. They knew what he did. They knew what he talked about. How could you have possibly fooled them into thinking that you were their resurrected Savior? You would have to have somebody who looked a lot like Jesus, but also the imposter would have had to have performed miracles, because that was one of the things that the disciples claimed made them sure that it was actually him resurrected, because he performed miracles for them. Also, again, it doesn't explain the empty tomb. Like I said, we'll get to that a little later. Also, were the claims just exaggerated? So let's say, okay, the disciples saw something happened, but the account was later embellished as legend. They took crazy pictures and then later everything was photoshopped. Here's some problems with that idea. The disciples were reporting the resurrection from the very start, and we know this from the early creeds and the early writings. So the fact that the resurrection was maybe just an idea that came about like way later is an idea that doesn't make sense to what's just available to us historically. I mean, say what you want about the resurrection, but the fact is that the disciples were talking about the resurrection first thing, and it was at the forefront of the gospel that they were preaching. And we know this because the students of the disciples reported what the disciples were preaching. The early church fathers, Clement, Ignatius, they reported exactly what the disciples were preaching at the time, and the resurrection is a big deal to them. Also, as we've mentioned already, there was not enough time for legend to spread. And besides, if it was a legend, it was kind of a boring legend. Because when you read Paul's story, Paul is an interesting case. I think that God gave us Paul because he is kind of the counterbalancing act to the story of the disciples, because Paul wasn't necessarily an eyewitness to the crucifixion and those events that happened right then and there. It was a couple of years later that Jesus appeared to him. But Paul was a severe skeptic. Like, he was so skeptical that he was killing Christians all by himself. But when Paul was converted, he didn't actually go to the apostles. He went to Arabia, and then he went to Damascus, and finally, after 3 years, that's when he finally decided to go see Peter. Because actually none of the apostles or disciples wanted to see him because they knew who he was. They knew that he was killing them, so it took some time before they realized, hey, I think this guy's okay. He also talked to James, Jesus' brother, who was already converted at that time, based on what's written in the book of Acts. He went to Syria, Cilicia. Point is if you're writing a legend, these aren't the kinds of things that you would include. Paul writes things in his, sometimes it's funny, you can quote verses out of, there's a verse in, I think it's Romans, where Paul says, oh, and don't forget to bring me the parchments.
Yeah.
It's not a legend, So it doesn't sound like legend, it sounds like history. This is a picture, you can't really see it, it's a picture of Paul actually getting on to Peter for the way that he was acting around the Jews at the time. Again, not something you would report in legend. The fact that the disciples had disagreements, or Peter and Paul had disagreements about how you should act toward certain people, that's not the kind of thing you report if you're trying to make up a legend or report a lie. So the fact is that what Paul wrote, and also what James wrote, because James himself was a skeptic, and he was the brother of Jesus. This is a picture of James, but I think they cheated because they just painted Jesus and said, no, this is James.
Well, he was his brother.
He was his brother.
Half-brother.
It was like, what if they thought James was actually the resurrected Jesus? What if he was just like, what if they saw James one day and they were like, hey, it's you, Jesus? But the problem is at that time, James was a skeptic. And he would have said, no, I'm not Jesus, I'm James. But then later, James did convert because Jesus appeared to him. So, point is that Paul and James agree with what is in the Gospels. We know this historically, we know this internally. And another thing that we've mentioned a little bit already is that the Gospels are humiliating. Just a few things. Jesus' family didn't believe him. That's not something that's good to report. Like, your family's not even on your side? What does that mean? Jesus couldn't perform miracles at home, like in his hometown. He refused to perform miracles, which looks like, he can't do it. People rejected Jesus, which is not something you want people thinking. Jesus was accused of demonic possession. Jesus said things that were hard to understand, and sometimes he seems to contradict himself. If somebody was trying to make this stuff up, turn it into legend, or embellish what the disciples wrote, you would think that they would make these things easier to understand, that they would make it smoother, so to speak. Jesus had a bad reputation for the company he kept. Like, he hung out with sinners, he hung out with tax collectors, he would have arguments with the Pharisees, and nobody liked this. The disciples consistently ask stupid questions, and they often behave rashly and rudely, sometimes violently, and Jesus rebukes them. Like, Peter thinks he's going to start a war, so he pulls out his sword and chops off the dude's ear. So the fact that these things are being reported about the disciples are humiliating. They're not the kinds of things that you would want being spread about you unless they were true, and there was a point behind them. Also, Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus. Like, he was one of them. He was one of the 12. He was one of their friends. He was one of their best friends who went around with them for 3 years. And, okay, sure, maybe he had, maybe he was a little rough around the edges, but he betrayed them. Most of the disciples ran away after Jesus was, including Peter, who was the leader. And also the women were the first to discover the empty tomb, which was an embarrassing fact back then because, honestly, the testimony of women was not highly regarded back then.
While you're on this, I'd like to suggest that there is a conspiracy documented in the Gospels, and that is that in the last meal, Jesus clearly communicated to the disciples that that would be their last meal, and that he was to die, and that that was God's will. And I think that if you read between the lines, he also communicated to them, because I just kind of envisioned the disciples abandoning him at this time, that he communicated to them that you must not follow me, that this must take place, and you must not come to my defense in this and interrupt God's will. And Peter, of course, disobeyed that. And I would suggest that in the account of Peter, that you have the Sanhedrin that is holding the court, and Jesus is before the Sanhedrin, not defending himself. And then you have the inner court, which is made up of the people who are yelling, "Crucify him," which we've come to know that these are the servants and the employees of the Pharisees primarily, who have told their employees, "You be here and you do this and you shout what we tell you to shout." And then you've got the outer court, which are Christ's followers. And when Peter was challenged, he was challenged to come to the defense of Christ. And he had to deny it because he was told, "You do not come to my defense during this trial."
That may have been true to some extent, but I would still dispute the fact that Peter weeps bitterly over the fact
Well, he
that
weeps bitterly because
after the third,
he knows that he couldn't come to Christ's defense. It's not that he did something wrong. It was he was extremely
at the end of
sorry.
the Gospel of John, that without going into lots of detail here,
Jesus asked him to repent of that.
Peter and Jesus had the conversation where he asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And it's kind of like there's a restoration factor going on here. I don't think he was denying him just out of self-defense. I think there was more to it than that.
It wasn't out of self-defense. It was God's will.
I don't know that he had that in mind. But again,
Christ had communicated it's God's will, and I mean he said that, and he said.
I know that Jesus predicted all of those things in advance. I agree with that, and he told them to do a lot of things. But
And then you have the conspiracy with Judas.
Christ also
I
said,
mean, clearly Christ knew what Judas, it was agreed upon between Christ and Judas what Judas was supposed to do. If Judas had evil in his heart, once he was found out before the act, he would have never gone through with it. I mean, that's just normal human nature. That he had a mission.
Judas is the one person in the Bible that says he was possessed by the devil himself.
Well,
So-
then you got to say, was it God's will he was doing, or the
Well, that
devil's
may
will?
very well. I would agree with you that it was God's will that he be crucified. In fact, Peter says
Okay,
that.
but was
Peter says
it
that
Satan's
blatantly.
will that he also be crucified? Because that was
Looks like it.
the start of the Christian religion.
Looks like it.
So if Satan knew that was going to be the start of the Christian religion,
But I don't think
surely
Satan
he
knew
would
that.
not wanted that to happen.
I don't think Satan knew that. However, we got to move on.
And in spite of that point, even if the disciples thought that was maybe part of the plan, it was still humiliating. And there were plenty of other things that were humiliating about it. Another thing to keep in mind is, I just put because J. Warner Wallace, because I've really enjoyed reading this book. Something that he really writes about is the supposed discrepancies between the Gospels. Like one Gospel will say this about the way something happened, or one Gospel will say something else about how that happened. But something that he points out, because he's a detective, is that actually, when there are multiple eyewitnesses involved in a case, you actually expect there to be variations in the story because each variation comes from a different perspective. So he uses an example from the book of Matthew and the book of Luke about Jesus being slapped in the face. Now in the book of Matthew, Matthew reports that Jesus was slapped in the face, and then the people who slapped him would say, "Prophesy to me, who slapped you?" Well, that sounds kind of silly because obviously Jesus would have seen who slapped him, right? But Luke actually helps us make sense of this because Luke actually reports that he was blindfolded and then slapped, and then they said, "Prophesy to us, who slapped you." So the fact, according to Wallace, the fact that Matthew and Luke have these two different accounts, that this seems to be some kind of like contradiction, no, they actually work together and they corroborate each other. There's a similar case with what Judas did with the bribe money that he accepted, and also Wallace works out the differences in the question of how many angels were at Jesus' tomb and who showed up at the tomb, and he notes that because this is one of the big ones that skeptics always pick on, is like how many angels were there, who actually showed up at the tomb, what actually happened on resurrection morning. And for Wallace, it's really easy to figure out what happened because he's used to looking at stories that vary in that way. And I just want to mention too that this example I told you in Matthew is exactly what he says in his cameo in God's Not Two, and it's the best part of the movie, so you don't really need to see the rest of it. Risen? Yes. God's Not Dead Too. Anyway, the apostles died for their belief. This is a crucial point, because we're still establishing the fact that we can trust what they wrote, but also why they wrote it, that they were telling the truth and that they were sincere. And this is honestly, this is the best. This is the best in terms of proving that they were sincere because they all died for their faith. James was killed by the sword between 44 and 45 AD. Peter was traditionally crucified upside down, around 64 AD. Andrew was crucified. Thomas was speared to death, I believe in India. Philip was tortured and crucified. Matthew was beheaded. Bartholomew was flayed and then crucified. James the Lesser, his head was beaten in. Simon was crucified. Judas Thaddeus was beaten to death. Matthias was hanged and then stoned while he was being hanged. John, there's a legend that John was boiled in oil and survived, but we do at least know that he was exiled to the island of Patmos. And Paul, we know for certain, was beheaded by Nero in 67 AD.
And is it your belief that all of them were given the option, all you have to do is denounce Jesus and worship our God?
Not all of them were killed in Rome, though.
Yeah, not all of them were killed in Rome. But, I mean, that seems to be the case. That was what Trajan talked about to Pliny, that, yeah, we need to give them this option. Because to them it was seen as an advantage to be able to present them in front of people and say, no, these were the people who denounced the faith. So the fact that we know that these guys all died, and know that they all died, with the exception of John, they all died around the same time.
At the very least, we know that what they were preaching, they knew in advance it would get them in trouble. And so even if they weren't given the option to, let's say, recant, they had a chance to not preach what they were preaching. So they had a chance to recant in one sense, regardless of whether they were given it right before their death.
Yeah.
Pamela.
I just want to say, wasn't James stoned to death?
James.
The regular James.
Jesus'
Well, there's
brother.
a
He was
different-
thrown from the temple wall and then stoned to death. He was about-
That was
James, the
different.
brother of Jesus.
That was
James the brother of John, or James the brother?
James, the brother of Jesus, was not one of the apostles.
Right.
Oh, okay, all right.
Right.
Yeah, there's lots of James. So many Jameses. Okay, but we really gotta move.
Yeah.
So anyway,
We're not near the end.
so
We're close to the end.
yeah. So what we're getting at here is if we compare what we know from the Gospels, from the New Testament, and also from the extra biblical evidence that we have these 12 facts. These are what Dr. Gary Habermas calls 12 minimal facts. that Jesus died by crucifixion, that he was buried in a tomb. His death caused the disciples to despair and lose hope. The tomb was empty, which is a contested fact among historians. The disciples had experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus, which is the most important proof that they saw him. The disciples were transformed from doubters to bold proclaimers. The resurrection was the central message of what they taught. They preached the message of Jesus' resurrection in Jerusalem. The church was born and grew. The Christian church was born and grew out of that time. Orthodox Jews who believed in Christ made Sunday their primary day of worship. James was converted to the faith when he saw the resurrected Jesus, because James was a family skeptic. And also Paul was converted to the faith. Paul was an outsider skeptic. Now, the importance of these facts right here is abductively, with abductive reasoning, we have to decide what is the best explanation for all of these facts that we have.
These are facts that are undisputed, basically, for the most part, by every historical scholar.
Right, with the exception of the tomb being empty, but still the majority of scholars tend to fall on that side, that the tomb was empty. These are facts that are well attested by historical scholars, even non-believers. And so any explanation that we try to come up for, that we try to have for how these things happen, it has to account for all of these explanations. You remember, as we've been going on and talking about some of the possibilities of maybe what happened, like were the disciples liars or were they delusional? Some of the objections have been others of these points that those objections don't answer. For example, the empty tomb, or the conversion of Paul, or the conversion of James, or the beginning, using Sunday as the day of worship. These are holes in the arguments. I forgot what our transition was here between me and you. Anyway, so was the tomb empty? Again, this is kind of a historic. I remember. Yeah. This is an important fact. Some historians don't agree that the tomb was empty or that we have any reason to think that it was empty, but the fact is that in the early times it would have been really easy to disprove what the Christians were saying by just opening up the tomb and showing the body, revealing it. Plus, it would have been hard to fake the empty tomb because everybody knew where it was. And again, if the disciples had stolen the body, that means that they were liars, and why would they die for something that they knew to be a lie? So the fact that there was that nobody presented a body is the best evidence that the tomb was empty. And another thing too is that in terms of skeptical objections to the story, note that we have all these ideas now about maybe possibilities that happen, but the fact is that in all of these extra biblical sources that we've been looking at, these ancient historical sources, not a single one of them offers an alternative explanation as to what happened. You note that, these guys were reporting that the Christians worship Jesus as God, that supposedly he was resurrected and that he was crucified, but nobody says, but they're crazy because this is actually what happened, ... They didn't say, but they actually stole the body, and then they were also overcome with grief that they were out hallucinating in the streets, and somehow people managed to follow. Nobody came up with any theories like this back then or wrote them down. They were just concerned with stopping them from spreading what they were teaching.
The only alternative theory to this would be that Jesus' body was thrown in a mass grave, and that they really didn't know where he was entombed. If that was the case, then the disciples would have known that that was the case in advance, and they still would have been lying when they reported that he was put in a tomb. So it's kind of like it still wouldn't have gone anywhere. Even if the skeptics couldn't have produced the body, the disciples knew they knew what happened to him.
And they still also wouldn't have had all of a sudden gone from being dejected and fearful to
Correct.
being wild proselytizers.
Yeah.
You can't explain that kind of, because people keep, especially in the olden days, people used to think, the Christians had, they had power. It's like, no, the Christians had absolutely no power in the old days. And a lot of people don't remember that.
I don't even remember what the next one is.
There's one more. Another important thing to remember too is that these writings by the apostles, they weren't alone. They had students, they had disciples of their own who they taught. And these were the early church fathers: Clement, Ignatius, Quadratus, Barnabas, Justin Martyr. These were people who knew the apostles personally. And they wrote about what the apostles told them. So like, I have a quote here from Ignatius, where he says, "For I know and believe that he, Jesus, was in the flesh even after the resurrection." And he's writing this as early as 110 AD. And when he came to Peter and his company, he said to them, "Lay hold and handle me, and see that I am not a demon without body." And straightway they touched him, and they believed, being joined unto his flesh and his blood. Wherefore also they despised death, nay, they were found superior to death. And after his resurrection he ate with them and drank with them. This is what Ignatius was writing as early as 110 AD, which means that this idea of the resurrection was not something they made up later. Ignatius was directly a student of John. John was there. He was probably the youngest of the apostles. So the fact that this tradition, that these ideas, we can trace them through history, they didn't just pop up randomly at some time later, that leaves us with, well, frankly, it leaves us with the, what could the best possible explanation be? I guess Dan will talk about what the best possible explanation is.
Well,
Best
does
possible.
anybody not know what this is a picture of, by the way?
Yeah.
Does anybody not know? Okay.
Shroud of Turin.
I'm not going to go into the evidence for the Shroud of Turin. I just think that resurrection would be the best evidence for the minimal facts.
But the case for the Shroud of Turin is really compelling.
Yeah, if you haven't heard it, you should. I find it very interesting that in an age of science, God has given us a piece of something we can actually study with science
Empirical.
that shows the resurrection. So who was Jesus? Real quick, we'll go through the options. Is he a myth? Was he a legend? This is a real billboard by American atheists. Can't really read that. You know it's a myth. This season celebrate reason. This is a quote, literally came from just a few days ago. It was on my Facebook feed from a mutual friend of ours who's an atheist. Blows my mind that people think Jesus was a real person. What a crazy world we live in.
Is a real person.
Yeah, he is a real. Yeah, was.
In other words, he's contesting.
He's
that Jesus-
contesting that Jesus never even existed.
Right, but
Yeah.
he is.
Okay. But first of all, there's really no serious historical scholar who advocates this. There's just not. Even atheistic scholars don't deny that Jesus existed. Okay. There are more testimonies of Jesus' existence than Augustus Caesar. So if you're going to deny that Jesus existed, we might as well just deny all of ancient history. All ancient historical methodology would become futile. All right. The New Testament becomes the greatest fraud ever perpetuated on mankind at that point. How did early Christians get all those non-Christians to write about it if it didn't happen? From whence would Christianity even start if Jesus never existed? And our calendar is based on the non-existence. I mean, to me, it just makes no sense that Jesus didn't exist. He did exist. The question is, what do we know about him? And we've already seen that what we know about him from secular sources matches really well with what we know about him from biblical sources. So he's not a myth. Well, maybe he was just a man. Duran, what do you think? You think he was just a man? Is that
Maybe he was
possibility?
just a man. I mean, the point of all this is that we can trust what the disciples wrote, what the New Testament writers wrote. We can trust that they were sincere, but the question is, was Jesus himself actually what he claimed to be? So are there explanations for what he claimed to be? Which is namely that he claimed to be God. So was he a myth? No, it doesn't appear so. Was he only a man? Well, I mean, we already kind of discussed this idea that it was all just a legend that came out later, but we've pretty much established that it couldn't have been a legend. So, based on the fact that the disciples were really sincere about what they believed, what are some possibilities that if Jesus was real, of what actually happened. One popular one that arose, really not that long ago, was the swoon theory, was that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, that he was crucified and he only appeared to be dead. But there are many problems with this, namely that the Romans were really good at their job. They were really good at killing people and making sure that they were dead. Plus, we have some evidence from the Bible itself that seems to indicate that Jesus was actually dead. Like the fact that they pierced his side and blood and water came out is a known symptom, and I forgot the medical terms for it. But
Well, the thing about it, if he was a man, basically, then the disciples were either fooled, which we've already seen that doesn't really make sense, or they were lying, and we've already seen that doesn't really make sense.
Right.
So.
The imposition theory is that the disciples stole the body. We already discussed, like, why would they steal the body? Maybe it would be to put it in a different tomb or whatever, but then why would they invent the story of the resurrection to save face or power? But then why would they die for what they knew to be a lie? Doesn't make sense. There's the hallucination theory, which we've already kind of touched on. The disciples hallucinated the resurrected Jesus, but the problem is that they touched him. They touched him, and we've already touched on this as well. So that doesn't seem to make sense of what maybe happened. The idea that Jesus had a twin brother is kind of a crazy theory that some people like to adhere to, but the problem with that is that the Gospels tell us who the family of Jesus was, and this is where the importance of James comes in, because James was a brother of Jesus, and he was a skeptic at first, and he didn't become a believer until the resurrected Jesus appeared to him, and that is discussed in the book of Acts, and he also refers to it in the book of James, the book that he wrote. Then there's the conspiracy theory that the disciples just deceived everybody with myths, but clearly, like we've already discussed, like, why would people believe them? Why would they go for that?
Were they accurate on so many other things?
Yeah. Point is like there are so many attempts to explain like what exactly happened if Jesus was only a man, which the reason these are important is because this is typically the kind of naturalistic explanation that skeptics go for, because they don't deny that Jesus was a real person. So they can't get away from that. But once you're left with the fact that he was a real man, well, obviously you don't want to go with that he performed miracles. So you have to come up with some kind of historical, naturalistic explanation. Yeah. So what I challenge people is to give it a try. Everybody's doing it. Try to come up with a story that explains what happened. William Lane Craig asked Bart Ehrman to do this one time. He said, "Go ahead, give me an account. Give me what you think happened." And Bart Ehrman, who is one of the foremost skeptics and scholars on the subject, he couldn't give a story that he thought actually happened. He just said, well, it was probably a combination of they were grieving or somebody took the body for this reason or that reason. And William Lane Craig is just, he pulls out the minimal facts. He's like, that doesn't explain Paul. And Bart Ehrman's like, well, maybe this happened to Paul. And he's like, well, that doesn't explain James. Well, maybe this happened. Point is, there is no alternative explanation from a naturalistic standpoint. So
Yeah, Bruce.
One of the best responses to this is Gary Habermas when he's being, argued against about these things. He'll say, well, just a minute, he'll get out a piece of paper and a pencil and say, all through my conversation now, I've been referring to validated first century source material. And you have these theories, and I just wonder, I missed when you told me what first century sources you're quoting when you talk about swooning so just tell me, I want to write them down and go look them up.
yeah, exactly.
Conversation ended.
Actually, I think Matthew reports that the Pharisees claimed that the disciples stole the body.
Yes.
So that was their first judgment of that.
Right, well, the penalty for those two soldiers that were guarding the tomb under orders was death if they failed in their
Right.
task. And so when they were knocked out apparently by an angel or
Yeah.
two angels.
And that's in the movie Risen.
The stone was too heavy to move.
Right.
It took like 4 men or something to move the
I
stone.
think it was more than that.
Yeah, and so if the disciples were gonna steal the body, they would have had to kill the two soldiers,
Right.
move the stone, and get the body, and touch a dead body, which is all against the law.
Right.
So,
All
All right. So
what's the next possibility?
So what's another possibility?
I'll just let you stay over there and change the
Oh,
slides.
okay.
How about that?
Is it possible that Jesus was just a liar? That he was a myth? That he was just trying to cause
Oh, we've
trouble?
already seen it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that the disciples were lying, but maybe Jesus was lying and he fooled them. Bart Ehrman wrote a introduction to the book, Jesus the Magician. I really don't know whether this is the premise of this book, but I mean, it at least shows that some people have the idea that that Jesus is actually out here deceiving. He's a charlatan, right? He's lying about it, and he's the one that fooled them. If he was the best one ever, because you think about what it's resulted in today. But it goes against the testimony that he was without sin. People who are charlatans just don't. They betray themselves sooner or later. They just simply do. And Jesus invited many people to say, look, can you convict me of sin? And even the disciples themselves reported that Jesus was without sin. There's nothing that they ever saw that gave any indication whatsoever that he was lying. And certainly they would have known the truth after he died and didn't come back. So it's hard to be lying about your own resurrection. So I don't think it's very possible at all that he was a liar, but maybe he was crazy. What do you think, Duran? You think he was just nuts?
I think he was a lunatic. His family said so in Mark 3:21. They said he is out of his mind.
By the way, you can get this on a T-shirt from the Arrogant Atheist website.
Jesus in a straight jacket. The problem with this concept is, well, first of all, in that story in Mark, Jesus later just completely proves them wrong. And second of all, if he was crazy, he doesn't bear the marks of a crazy person, because everybody regarded him as a wise teacher. And if he was crazy, he would have been just battling nonsense. But everybody regarded him as a great teacher. And, crowds of people would come, crowds of hundreds and thousands would come to hear him teach and to see him and to touch him and for him to heal them. This is not somebody who seems like they're crazy. This is not somebody who people wouldn't trust. People seem to put a lot of trust in him, and they would come from far away to see him if they knew that he was even relatively close by.
And how many in here have ever spoken to a person personally that has lost touch with reality?
Yeah.
Okay, if you know what that's like, you can tell.
Yeah.
Why am I thinking of L. Ron Hubbard right now?
Not naming names, but if you write science fiction novels.
We only got, just a few left.
Yeah. And the other problem, of course, with this too is even if he was just crazy and babbling nonsense, like once he died and didn't come back from the dead, that would have kind of put a damper on whatever he said. So what was another option? Maybe he was...
Yeah, maybe he's a mystic. In other words, maybe he was just misunderstood. They're reporting him that he's God, but he's not God in the sense of kind of like what we think about. Really, this imports New Age ideas into the Bible. I mean, this is a modern concept that he was like the Christ consciousness, that he was deity, like we're all deity. This is not biblical teaching. I mean, this flies in the face, basically, of the biblical concept of God, the biblical concept of what the Christ was, or even of what mankind is, for that matter. And then we still have that resurrection thing. If he did really rise from the dead, and he predicted that that was going to be the case, that's not mystical religion that we're talking about there. That's not we're all God. He is who he said
And
he
also,
was.
the crucifixion is not an invented fact.
Yeah, and that's part of it.
And this kind of stuff is nothing about real stuff.
Right. So there is one other alternative, though. I mean, that maybe it wasn't God who did it. I mean, maybe it wasn't.
I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens.
Everybody know who this guy is?
This is Giorgio Tsoukalos. He's one of the leading producers and interviewees on the Ancient Aliens show. The fun thing about, I'm not even sure if that show is actually serious about the things they say, because they literally ascribe everything to aliens. The invention of everything from the invention of Velcro to the positioning of pyramids.
He can do a lot with a haircut.
It's true. But he's a very charismatic speaker, and I think that he at least is very sincere about this. But here's the case that they make. Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world," which clearly means that he ascended in a UFO. And I think it's just funny that his UFO has a fish sticker. It also has a Starbucks coffee. So just knew there were better times ahead.
Yeah.
These are the promised days. This is the land of promise.
If you want answers to this, if you really want answers to this, get the book in the back by the RTB group
Yeah.
called Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men.
Oh,
Christian Perspective on UFOs.
Yeah.
Excellent book.
Which is basically that, number one, it's not very probable that there are other life habitable planets out in the universe. Also, that it's not very probable that even if there were, that they would have technology that would be able to travel to Earth because it's millions of light years away, and that's just not possible.
And let's not travel into too much detail. They also,
Yeah.
aliens also don't teach Christian doctrine either, just in case you're wondering.
And also,
But
let's
wormholes?
just like leave it at that's not what the disciples said, and that's not what Jesus said. That's not what they taught. That's not what it looked like. So, hang on just a moment.
That only
We'll
leaves
just-
really one alternative.
Yeah. So the only alternative left is that Jesus is Lord.
Amen.
He really was resurrected God who appeared to his disciples in a timely manner in the first century, right at the time when he chose to give his life and sacrifice himself for our sins. And he left behind enough of a trail of breadcrumbs that we could be relatively certain of his deity. And we can know this because we have these historical records, we have these extra biblical records, we have the New Testament, and the New Testament, many things in the New Testament fulfill the prophecies that are written in the Old Testament, and the traditions that the theology and the traditions that the apostles taught in the first century was handed down to their students, and they carried out those traditions, and they would correct people who tried to deviate from that, and that has endured for 2 millennia down to this day, where we stand before you, just as the apostles stood before the Jews and the Gentiles and proclaimed that Jesus is Lord. He is the resurrected Savior, that he is here to rescue us from our sins, and that eternal life is available to us, and joy is available to us in him, in his Spirit.
Amen, bro. Apologies for the length of time, but we'll turn it back over to Rod and maybe take a question in the last 30 seconds here.
Yeah. We usually try to close down formal discussion by 9 o'clock, and we got about 3 minutes. And we will. I do want to have a drawing for a book. So, a question that's really burning. You got to.
Well, just one, I mean, I can't remember where it is, but doesn't the Bible say somewhere that even if you've gone to the uttermost parts of the universe, I mean, it really sounds like travel outside the planet is possible.
Well,
Wherever you've gone.
you can travel outside the planet, you're just not going to get anywhere fast.
Well, the word, I don't know that.
You should really read that book because it's really easy to read and it's really cool.
This is
They
the
handle
Hugh
everything.
Ross book?
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
good, it's
I'm thinking about
kind
I'm thinking
of, it's
about
Hugh
the
Ross,
Bible.
Ken Samples.
I didn't feel like it had enough meat
Thank you.
at the end of it. I was really expecting more.
I heard.
Other external evidence is with respect to the prophecies that he fulfilled.
Yes.
We didn't even get into that.
And then I want to say one thing regarding Paul's list of sufferings which he endured in the last half of the 11th chapter of 2 Corinthians. I mean, that's a really, he would have had some sense knocked into him to bring it around to a right perspective if he was wrong.
Right.
But, he had talked with the disciples, he knew them, and he knew what had happened as he met Christ and was taught by him.
And I challenge people to honestly, try to come up with a better explanation for these facts that we have, for this information that we have. I would encourage you to challenge yourself because, I mean, there came a point in my faith, in my walk with God, where I started having some doubts about the resurrection myself, and I eventually just had to honestly face these questions that I had, and what I found was that these questions that I had and these scenarios I had in my head, there were answers for all of them. That that there are rebuttals to these objections. You still have to take that step of faith, but really challenge yourself and ask yourself the hard questions, and I believe you'll be rewarded for that.
Thank you both very much. We're going to invite you to stay around and have conversations. We sometimes do till 10 o'clock. So we invite you to have further conversations. We're going to come to a close.